Hey everybody, Cody Menz here with another video covering a upcoming tank, or if you're watching this, it might be released already, the Type 63, which is a premium tier 8 Japanese heavy tank. This tank most likely, I'd say, is probably the favorite for the Holiday Ops tier 8 tank, just because the Japanese heavy tank line kind of is coming up next, which might be at the end of 2023, but is more likely to be early parts of 2024. With it, it's bringing a new gun mechanic to the game, featuring essentially two different reload times for a single shotgun. One basically firing normally, works just as you would expect it to. However, if you let the gun cool a little bit longer between shots, you gain a lot more accuracy. So the Type 63 is going to be the premium tank, kind of preceding the tech tree tanks, and most likely what Wargaming has done in the past. This ends up being kind of a feature in the Holiday Ops boxes for a new tier 8. In any event, that could definitely change. Let's get into the tank here and see, is it going to be worth the hype essentially for a new tank line, new game mechanics, stuff like that, or is it just going to kind of be okay? Now, do note, the stats could change, from now to then. I think there's a small possibility of them changing a little bit, maybe like reload times most likely would be my guess, because there's a very placeholdery amount, in my opinion, at 2,000 for the base in DPM essentially. Anyway, for what Wargaming has in here, the Type 63 project was an independent development by Mitsubishi Heavy Industries to improve firepower and armor while maintaining high mobility. This tank does have essentially a different type of turret, essentially an isolated central armament compartment turret. And it does have hydropneumatic suspension as well, where the hull essentially rocks forward and backwards. So it's a little bit unique. Probably works similar, I'm assuming, to like the STB1 where it's automatic. We'll get into that in a little bit here. Otherwise, it does say, so at the rear, essentially there's an autoloader. It is a single shot, like it doesn't have any magazine or anything like that, and work on the project was essentially discontinued at the stage of the concepts and turret patents, so it didn't really get off the drawing board. In any event, it's got some neat stuff on the gun here. Don't know essentially what their purpose for it, outside of I'm assuming for telling you that the gun can cool down. That would be my assumption. Anyway, so armor, we'll do a quick look here, and then before we get into the actual stats in tanks.gg too, just to show, so the kind of oscillating, or not oscillating, but essentially the hull and the hydropneumatic suspension. Now, armor, this thing doesn't have great armor on the hull. Like, this is 100% going to be a hull down tank. It says it gets up to 14 degrees of gun depression. I'm assuming the tanks.gg model you'll see in a minute here might need a little bit more tweaks, because I wasn't able to get it up to 14 degrees. But in any event, not much hull armor. Turret armor is surprisingly actually really darn good, though, where when you're going to be able to get this thing hull down, so with the gun pointing down and everything, your main weak spots will be if anybody can kind of hit these bits here, and right around the gun from the looks of it will be like the main weak spots. Otherwise, this thing does not have like cupolas and stuff like that. But it's a little bit different with how the gun essentially goes up and down. So we'll take a look here. So this link's in the video description here for tanks.gg, to where you'll see essentially, so this part of the turret doesn't actually move, which we'll kind of go over to the visual model here. So this part doesn't move on the tank. It's mainly just this part, this big T, T for type, that moves, and also the hull. So essentially you're going to be able to rock back and forth when it comes to the gun depression when you're kind of playing the tank, and it should do this automatically, would be my assumption. Same goes for, if you're pointing a gun up too. So a little interesting. And coupled with the new gun mechanic, it'll definitely be an interesting tank. Now, looking at like the tanks.gg model here, it only goes to 12 degrees of gun depression over the front. Not sure, if that's intentional, or like looking at the model right now, it could just be because this is an unreleased tank. Like, it doesn't really get up to 14 degrees anywhere. It gets really close, like a little bit under 13 degrees off the like back left corner of the tank. If you're looking at like the bottom left corner of this little screen, which is probably not super big, but it doesn't actually show that it has 14 degree gun depression over the front. I'm assuming, so like right now it's 12, I'm assuming that'll basically be cleared up, and it'll probably be 14 degrees over the front of the tank, essentially by release time would be my guess. Armor wise though, once you get this thing into its, max gun depression with a little bit to spare, you do have, some weak spots here, and this is essentially against, a high pen heat round for the tier, a little under 300 millimeters. You do have little weak spots, but they're not large. This thing is pretty solid armor wise frontally, for a tier 8 heavy tank. It's pretty darn good. So it's got that going for it, gun depression and also turret armor while hold down. Now getting into the rest of the stats, because basically just because that's pretty good doesn't mean the rest of the tank's actually great. Now, I threw in 5 different tanks here where it's honestly hard to find like an exact comparison, because so this tank, you have the new gun mechanic essentially. So with the cooling, where this 2000 base DPM, that's based off of the gun being able to fire as fast as possible, and with that you have 0.36 accuracy. If you let the gun cool, so instead of your reload time being 9.6 seconds, if you work off of the 12.3 second reload, your DPM basically drops down to 1561 about, rounding a little bit. So pretty bad compared to the rest of the tanks here. You go from being one of the highest in this comparison to the lowest. But you do have the best accuracy in that scenario, 0.27. So pretty good. That's actually really, really useful. Like, you can play the tank essentially 2 different ways. If you're engaged in a fight, essentially you start firing away because you need to get rounds out. If you really need to pinpoint your shots or you want to play further away, you can do that as well. So it's pretty interesting, this new game mechanic they're adding in, and coupled with the hydropneumatic suspension giving you that extra gun depression over the front and back of the tank. That's pretty cool as well. Overall though, so the gun doesn't hit as hard as you might expect, so 320 damage. So for your single shot heavies, like compared to the Luva T832 M3Y, it's essentially in line with them, but less than. I threw into T34 and Tornwagen because I feel like their gameplay is kind of, similar. Penetration's pretty decent though, so 230 for the basic round. You do have a premium heat round at 290, and then your HE rounds not really that usable, to be completely honest. It's it's just there. So pen's okay. Damage not great. Single shot heavy. But it's not awful. Your main attribute for your gun is going to be the gun depression to work off of, and I feel like having that super accurate shot when you're able to reload and kind of wait a little bit, that's something to where these other tanks, you're sitting there, you're not getting any benefit for not shooting, whereas this thing actively becomes more accurate, essentially erasing RNG with that 0.27 value with just basic stats here with no equipment, crew skills, food, stuff like that on there. So that's basically the strength of this tank. Getting into like the survivability, so 1400 HP, pretty low. For a tier 8 heavy, that's really bad. It's definitely not comparable to like the Luva, the Tornwagen, other tanks, where some medium tanks, I'm pretty sure some medium tanks have a little bit higher than 1400, but I could be off by a little bit there. But not good, you know, for a tier 8 heavy. So definitely something to note. Armor wise, you know, all things considered, hold down. You do have, you know, 14 degrees of gun depression from what it's claiming here. I feel like you're definitely comparable to these tanks when you're hold down and people aren't able to essentially penetrate you, you know, shooting the where that's going to be really, really good for this tank. You're not going to be able to angle your turret too much. You know, you're definitely going to have to point directly towards people, but the tank, you know, armor wise seems pretty darn good hold down. Now, mobility. The tank, you would think, is a little bit faster from what it looks like. It's not very fast. So 35 kilometers an hour, forward, 12 in reverse. Specific power here, pretty decent. You know, the specific power is pretty good, and the terrain resistance is pretty good. So it's a little bit more maneuverable than you might think, you know, based off of the stats, but it's still not, you know, that top speed really limits it to where it's still not going to be fast. So that's one thing, limiting factor, to where it is close, you know, to like the T-34 or the Luva, the where, you know, if you put a turbo on this, you know, that's a different story, but it's definitely slower than it might look, you know, when you first glance at the tank. Concealment, it's got good camo, but low camo values like this don't really matter. And your V range actually isn't as good as, say, like a Luva, but it's not god-awful. It's just there. It's just average. So overall, like, do I think, you know, it's worth getting hyped about this tank? I'd kind of say yes, just because it's a little bit different with that gun mechanic. I think that's going to be pretty much the main selling feature of this tank, because playing it like mid-range, you know, long range, you're able to do that because 0.27 base accuracy is really freaking good. You know, for a heavy tank, for any tank really at tier 8, and that's just with 100%, you know, crew with nothing else on it. And then otherwise, you know, if you're firing faster, like 0.36 isn't a great value, you know, to kind of have, but your DPM, you know, it's pretty good with, you know, that value. So you're kind of able to play this tank two different ways and have really good gun depression to be able to hold down. And that's about it. You know, it's kind of a more interesting version of a single shot tank, where a lot of tanks that Wargaming's been kind of shoving into the game, I feel like, you know, they have, you know, gimmicks or auto loaders, auto reloaders and stuff, and the game's been progressing that way, and like double shot, you know, auto loaders. And this tank's probably one of the more interesting single shot tanks that they're adding in, because of the improved accuracy if you let your gun cool, and also the basically the design of the tank with the gun depression and everything. So I think when this does come out, and I think it's a pretty good lock for it to be the Holiday Ops tier 8 like premier tank, unless the Japanese heavies come before then, but I would doubt that. I think they're going to be more of a January, February thing. I think this tank's pretty much a lock for that, and I think it is going to be pretty interesting. I think it's going to be worth picking up just statistically, where it doesn't seem broken, you know, at least based off of these stats. They could change things, but at least for the time being, this seems like it's going to be a pretty interesting tank. Not revolutionary by any means, but for tier 8, I think it'll fit pretty well, and it'll work pretty good against higher tiers. It's going to be really strong against lower tiers, obviously, when it's hold down, but I don't think it's going to be broken just because, like, the whole armor is not great. It does have limiting, you know, factors with, you know, if you're firing outside of that mode, you're not the fastest tank, you know, your accuracy is not the best, you know, so at the end of the day, it's not breaking, I guess, the balance wheel of the game, but it is putting something a little bit new in the game to freshen things up. Anyway, thanks for watching this video. Hopefully you enjoyed this, and it explained a little bit about the Type 63 that's coming up into the game, and I'll see you in another one. Have a good one.